just to let you know, those of you who don't know me, I am an organization scholar, but my background is very much in design. I've been working with a design approach to organizing and innovation for many years in research projects and in teaching, before at the School of Design and Crafts in Gothenburg, University of Gothenburg, and now at Chalmers, where I also now do research on self-managing organizations. It's a project that I have just started with my colleagues, Maria Enquist and Konstantin Bremer. But this talk today, I would say, is really about my frustrations about organizations today, or the experience of organizations today, working in large organizations and being surrounded by organizations, you know, whether as a parent for kids in school, or as a patient, or a citizen in general, or just simply as a customer trying to get in touch with customer service or something. There seems to be something that's not quite right, not quite working with our organizations in the so-called knowledge society. We are told that people are the most important resource, that our creativity, capacity for critical thinking is critical for success in our personal lives as well as for our organizations. But on the other hand, my everyday work experience as a teacher and a researcher, it often feels like the development going in the other direction. So my work is directed by study plans, knowledge objectives, grading procedures, journal rankings, directives of funding bodies, policy guidelines, strategy, ethical, and so on, not to mention all the performance measures that we all have to adhere to. So, I mean, there are often good intentions behind it, and they're very helpful, but taking together the experience of working in an organization today often ends up a feeling of frustration, you know, that my knowledge and experience isn't necessarily valued. And I feel I spend less and less time doing what I feel I'm supposed to be doing, and more time making sure that boxes are ticked and adapting to all these structures. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, no wonder people are getting stressed out and less engaged. So what's behind all this? Well, as an organization scholar, I go back to definitions, to the basics. So let's start with looking at what is actually an organization. I have several books at home trying to define what an organization is. But if you go to the bare bones definition, an organization is a group of people who work together in an organized way for a shared purpose, right? So it's not that complicated. A bunch of people who want to do something together. In practice, of course, it's not so simple. And in organization theory, you talk about the key problems of organizing, which is basically providing direction, ensuring coordination, allocating tasks, and rewarding behavior. These are the things that we need to do to get this to work well. And that's what organization studies is about to a great extent. So a model, what's a model then? Well, that's a physical or conceptual representation of an object or a person or a system, such as an organization. So a model is a way for us to try to understand or show in a representation, abstract or like this, visual of a phenomenon, such an organization. And as you know, typically representations of organizations are organization charts, like this, a pyramid. Here we try to at least put in some representations of people to have them in there. But taken together, it's basically an idea about how we should work together, organizational model. And as an idea, it's about our social and cultural understanding, our worldviews that are reflected in this idea. So to figure out, okay, where do these ideas come from, our ideas of organizations and of our organizational models, I went back to look at two people who could be from the early days of management theory, who will stand as the flag bearers of two completely different worldviews. They were working at the same time, early 20th century, and when the first ideas for management became an area, and I think they're equally relevant today because their traces are there. So the first person will probably sound familiar, maybe even look familiar to several of you. Frederick Winslow Taylor. You've heard about Taylorism, perhaps. Frederick Taylor, just to give you a little background, because I think the life experience defines our worldviews. Frederick Taylor came from a pretty well-off family in Pennsylvania. His father was a high-profile lawyer, and he was expected to follow in his father's path, and which he actually started to do. He got accepted at Harvard Law School, but very quickly dropped out, allegedly for health reasons. And instead, he started to work on the shop floor as a machinist. There, he advanced very quickly through the rows, and in just a few years, he ended up being head of or chief engineer. And at the same time, he had actually taken a mechanical engineering degree on correspondence. There's a defining life experience, which he describes in his book, The Scientific Principles of Management, which you may also have heard of. It's a very famous book, his only book, where he describes how when he, in his first job as a foreman, told the workers plainly that now he was working on the side of management and he would do everything he can to get as much work as possible out of their day. Basically because he thought they were busy and soldiering, maska, as we say in Swedish. And he was so surprised that they got really pissed off. And they started actually bullying him and what he saw as a war between workers and managers was going on at the site. So this was his driving, he wanted to correct that, give them the same, if they had the same goal, which for him was money, then everything would be resolved. So Taylor's worldview is what we tend to call mechanistic. He sees the world basically as the machine. His world is the factory. So he focuses on things, right? Parts in a system or in organization, that means structures. Management to him is a rational science guided by generic laws and principles, where you design the one best way. There's always one best way. His mechanistic, which is a word that I kept also in my publications because my Scottish co-author Barbara Simpson thought you can't translate that once I describe what mechanistic is. Basically a certain view of human nature, but I think the Swedish word also has certain ethical implications to it. And it's very important, I think, for understanding a worldview, what's your basic mechanistic. For Taylor, it was very clear that what he wanted to do was to change the system as it worked then from people to system, right? Because he thought that the workers had too much space for the personal judgment, and he didn't trust them because he saw them as lazy, untrustworthy, and also intellectually and morally inferior to managers. So they're different kinds of people. So trust in the system instead, and then you need to have external control. You need to put up a elaborate control system to make sure they don't cheat because you don't trust them. So this is the background to his solution to the fundamental problems of organizing that we just talked about. You need to design the optimal system that will deliver the best efficiency. This way you would get rid of the wastes of human effort and have maximum efficiency. Of course, you would have to specify exactly what tasks to be done, and then select the most suitable workers, set up the control and reward system, and you have to train the workers, or managers have to train workers in doing their specific task the right way. So if this sounds familiar, it's not so strange, because this is the basis for all our traditional hierarchical systems with the so-called command and control systems. The next person I wanted to bring up, which has been a great source of inspiration to me, is Mary Parker Follett. Few people have heard of her, but she's actually also been a very influential person in management theory, mostly by being a secondary source. People like Peter Drucker, who's a very famous management guru from the era of the knowledge work, for example, bases most of his work on her. She's sometimes called the grandmother of management. Fallet obviously has a different background, not least because she was a woman. As a woman, you're not allowed to have the traditional careers. You're not allowed to do a PhD in those days, which I'm sure she would have, because as opposed to Taylor, who didn't study much, he did his own correspondence, she loved to study. Throughout the years, she studied philosophy, scientific methods, psychology, history, political science, economy, philanthropy, ethics, and literature. I'm sure there's more, but you see the breadth of her interests. So it's humanities and social science, as well as economics and natural science. She was finally admitted, after having to have stayed home and taken care of her mother. She was admitted to the annex at Harvard, which was the first time that they admitted women in this kind of special little annex. And after that, she worked as a teacher, as an assistant at a law firm, and then embarked on a career in social work, where she worked with settlement houses, which were also very popular at the time, where middle-class women often went out in the slum areas to work together with people, immigrant workers, to work on how they together solve their problems and alleviate poverty. So this was her defining life experience, which gave her a strong faith in ordinary people and their potential for developing a sense of personal responsibility for governance and informed, independent judgment. So they just need to be given the right means and the right training, and everybody can be a self-governing citizen. So that led her to a very different worldview. I put flowing here. Very often you see mechanistic and organic as opposite. I didn't use that partly because Fallet didn't like it herself, because she said an organization is not an organism. People can come and leave as they want. It's much more fluffy than that, even though there's much more to it than the metaphor of the machine or the hierarchy, because it focuses on the relationships. Flowing comes for me from yes, I'm trying to highlight here that what she focuses on is not so much the organization as organizing. So she's going from entities, things that Taylor focuses on, to experiences and activities. There's always going to be an organization. That's not the question. You know, we need structures and so on. But what really matters is what we are actually doing. It's our experiences and our activities. So the organizing to her is about a democratic social process leading to integration, to a shared evolving purpose. So that's also creative, because new ideas and new opportunities always come out of this group process, as you said, working together. So clearly, her människosyn is very different. It's people first, right? It's not the structures, it's people. And she has a profound trust in people, faith in all humankind. Everybody has something to contribute to work. The trick is to figuring out what that is. And that's basically the objective of an organization. It relies on self-control more than on external control, more than somebody coming and telling you what to do and following up. That's supposed to come from the inside. So the solution to the fundamental problems of organizing then becomes fundamentally different. It's about designing, so the process of designing a dynamic whole. So the dynamic whole is constantly changing and evolving. So development is her core purpose. Where Taylor was concerned with efficiency, she's concerned with development. So now I don't see any faces, so I feel like I'm speaking to Mary Parker Follett here, actually, which is nice. She looks like she looks like a school teacher, and I have not done my homework on this picture, which makes me a little nervous. But it's sad that she was actually extremely sociable and had this capacity of engaging with people in any walks of life. So hopefully you can this resonates with you, and you may recognize this from your own work life. I think that it's clear that both of these logics are highly present today in different ways. You can see traces of them in your organizations, or at least I can do. It's interesting to see, though, I think if we look back now, we know that Fallet was mainly right. You know, if we talk about the worldview and människosyn. She was also into science and said, you know, I hope for the future that we'll do a lot of research to figure out the methods for how to do this group organizing thing and help us towards that. And she was completely convinced that her människosyn would be proven right. And I think it's fair to say that in many ways it has, and in many ways our organizations have adapted to it. On the other hand, we are seeing also, like I said at the beginning, the experience working in organizations today is that we have more and more external control systems, which these performance measurement systems are clearly a part of. They are definitely in the Taylor realm. So these worldviews are obviously completely incompatible, but they're still there. So that's why I find it so important to look at our systems today, our organizational models, and to see what ideas are they based on, and so what are the implications for that. and when should we use what model. So now we already know here that the Taylor view can be should be in the right place when it's only about making something efficient, right? That's not necessarily the case when it's about human development, which is where Fallet comes in. What is going on today in, for example, in my area where I work, where there is a lot of development going on, working with research and education, we have a Fallettian purpose, right, which is about the developing, getting the best out of people. We believe in collaboration. We believe that new ideas and creativity emerge out of collaborative processes. This is also what the design approach is about. It's about the experience. It's design approach, I think, is very Fallettian in that sense. And then we go back to our daily work, and we're supposed to go and tick the boxes, which is in the other realm. We have all our performance measures. We're supposed to achieve this, 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 and this in our projects. And these measures may or may not be related to our overall purpose. So when that happens, of course, the flowing and emerging collaborative open-ended purpose of development is hampered by the goal of efficiency. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm looking at Jonas here and Kalle because you're the only faces that I'm seeing.
It sounds familiar, and we'll keep an eye on the chat, and if something comes up there, we will send you a header.
If you have a question, yes, please, just if you have a question, just throw it in the chat and I will explain. Okay, so why did this come about? Okay, so we could talk about the background to this and the trends and so on for all day, but very quickly, I'll just say a couple of trends that I think are present. So enforcing the Tayloristic system is what organization scholars Patricia Bromley and John Meyer called hyper-organization. And that's and basically they argue that it's been an extreme focus and expansion of formalized organizations and organizing in the past few decades. So now we want to organize everything, right? Everything needs to be formalized and we need to have measures on it. Also things that are not necessarily, that were never measured before and can't really be measured. And where the measure as such is not necessarily connected to the overarching goal, which is what I talked about. We have a goal of development here, human development, and we put a lot of measures on it. I experience that all the time in education, right? It's supposed to be about learning, but what you measure is something else. We have knowledge goals, and that's like, I read so and so many articles. It's not really connected. So the reason behind this, they argue, is what they call a culture of irrationality or of rationality, which is actually irrational because of this disconnection, right? But we have a rhetoric to say, you know, okay, we need to do this rationally here. That's part of our culture. In a completely uncertain world, we need to have some stability. So we make up this rational box with all these measures. And I think this is most evident, you know, there's some scandal and on TV, you know, you have this responsible person coming up and say, oh, yes, I'm so sorry this happened. It's not somebody's fault, so we have to look over our routines, right? We have to go over our routines to make sure this doesn't happen again. You know, nobody says, okay, this person showed bad judgment, right? He shouldn't have thrown a party at Grand Hotel for, you know, this public agency or whatever. That was a bad idea. No, we have to look over our routines so it doesn't happen. So we've grown to have this kind of knee-jerk reaction that that's what we do. If the organization fails, let's organize some more. And I also have to add digitalization here. Technology is never good or bad, of course. It could be used for any purpose, but we're very fond of putting in an IT system to make stuff more efficient very quickly without thinking necessarily of the consequences. So that's also pushing, I think, this trend towards the Tayloristic model. But then, of course, we have, as always, the counter trends, so reacting against it. And then these are just things that I've worked with myself, so or been involved in, so it could be anything, but you of course have the design thinking and design service design and so on that you're all working with, or the agile movement. If you look at the original Agile manifesto, it's very close to these ideas. Then of course they're drawn into this packaging, into this rationality culture. Self-managing organizations is very much about that. The common thread here is to have this människosyn, I would say, to start with trust in people and that they can organize themselves into teams or groups, and that's the best way. You may have heard teal organization, next stage, holacracy. Yeah, there are all sorts of names for this and they're all different, but that's the one sort of factor that combines them all. And I would also just like to add here an observation that you also may have done, which is that in times of crisis, the tailor system breaks down, right? Because it's based on a mechanistic worldview where things don't change. It's there to counteract change. You don't want to have, like in the factory, things should be the same all the time. You don't want to have external things happening or whatever. So when something happens like a pandemic or a war, everything changes. You have to do things in a new way. Okay, what happens? Well, it turns out people are incredibly good at self-organizing. The most amazing examples we see all the time of how people just roll up their sleeves, talk to each other, trust each other, and say, let's fix this together. And figure out how to do it. And that's important to see, I think, because it shows us that self-management is actually our modus operandi in a normal situation, right? If it wasn't for this culture of rationality, if it wasn't for all of these large organizations that were there, we'd be pretty good at self-managing. You can also see it in, if you look at just any organization, we have the formal structures and then you have the informal structures, right? And the informal structures are often there to make sure that work is happening in spite of the formal structures, right? Like, how do we make this workarounds, and you have skunk work. So you have all these expressions to talk about, like, how do we get things done? How do we get development and so on in spite of the structures? So there's a lot of self-managing going on there, and we're actually quite good at it. So let's get back to Fallet. So what help can we get from her if, assuming we want to have other models than the prevailing Taylorian ones? Well, the first or the main insight, I would say, it's not about the model, right? Which I started off with. What are our alternative models? Because, you know, the point was, as she's saying, it's not the organization. Of course, you know, it's the most important thing isn't whether it's a hierarchy or decentralized. You know, I mean, of course, you should have both, right? You should get the benefits of scale, but you also get the benefit of the local initiative. And that's the important thing, right? So don't spend all your focus on the structures. It's all about the attitude. And the attitude should be responsible, experimental, and you have to also drop all your sort of ego things about it's my opinion that matters. You have to be able to step in the footsteps of the other person to come up to a new common idea. And this is the key to get this to work. And this is what the education should be about. It should be about the attitude, not about the specific tasks. You can figure them out, but the attitude has to be there. Secondly, it's about making things together, concrete activities. That's how we can achieve this integration and development and change, whatever. So just sitting there with a representation showing, okay, this is what our new organization looks like, and telling people, that's, you know, it's not going to come home to people. You have to actually be active in your participation and do something together. That's how we make sense of things. And that's why you also always have to start locally. Of course, you need a shared purpose, but the real work goes on the ground. And thirdly, and this is, I think, why Fallet isn't necessarily such a well-known house name. She doesn't offer any silver bullets. She doesn't offer the simple representations, the simple knowledge. She offers a series of principles, but she also says, you know, by all means use my principles, but make them your own, right? There are no absolute standard answers here. You have to enact them and make them your own, so they mean something for you in your situation, in your group. Questions?
I would actually get one here from Karina Tilling. She asks, I try to translate it now. How do you think about the public healthcare system, like home care? It seems like they go towards Taylorism, while they get a more and more difficult way to do it, but they don't go at the Fallet way. Why? What to do? I
also want to say that I have no personal responsibility of working in healthcare. My experience is mostly, you know, as a citizen and as a patient and so on. And I am, like everybody, I think, sitting there watching TV or having context, I feel, what should we say? I feel very sorry for people working in especially home care, because it just doesn't seem right. It seems that it's taking the tailor system to the extreme.
Sorry, Anna, we had one more reflection or question from Ruth. And it's, is there any drawback whatsoever with Fallet's approach? And she also says that I don't want the answer to the question should be yes.
Of course, it's very hard to get there. I'll get to both of these questions. I'll start with the home care, because I was thinking also last night about how do I give you an idea of what this could look like, right? And I'm going to tell you a few things about the case of Burts Org, which you may have, does it ring a bell to people? Is it familiar? It's a very famous case, so I suspect that most of you have heard of it. And I haven't studied it myself, so I'm not an expert, but I thought it would be appropriate here just to say a few words to show that it's absolutely possible to do it another way. Coming back to our sort of cultural conviction that we have to do more organizing, more rules, more routines, and so on as to be the solution. Or you can think about it as the other way. It's about, I think, having the opportunity and the courage to just try it out. So Burts Org is a very famous example in the self-managing area, and also, of course, in the healthcare area. It's a Dutch company, which was founded in 2006 based on the same frustrations. There must be a better way. So they built up the company, or it's actually a foundation, I think, based on a different model. But the core of it is the människosyn, which is aligned with Fallet's. You need to treat people like adults, starting with the patient or the client, as they call it. So the whole point is the assumption that people always want to be sort of responsible and self-managing, right? So that's their starting point. How can we help our client become self-managing? So it's all about building a relationship with them. And to do that, and figuring out together with them, how can we found a support structure around them? So the self-managing teams is the core entity, so to speak, of their organizational model. It's a team of maximum 12 people that set itself up in a local neighborhood, responsible for how they do it and so on. And then after those teams, so there's a network of teams, and after those teams, they set up the support system. And the point is to say here is the logic is, first you start with the människosyn, it's the philosophy and worldview that counts. Then you set up the structure based on the self-managing teams. And finally, you set up the support system, including a personalized IT system and a very, very, very slim overhead hierarchy, less than 1%. So, and of course, why is this example so attractive? Well, it seems to work. They always have top rates in client and employee satisfaction. And they're now over 10,000 people, and they're doing very well financially. So there is another way. This is just one way. I mean, there are plenty of other ways. I'm not sure what Burts Org would think of by representation of their organization, but they have to suit themselves because they call their model the onion model, where you have the client in the middle, and then you have the self-managing team and the support networks, and it's also sort of a network of teams. So that's just one example to say, of course, it's possible to do it another way. Practical challenges, are there any? I'm sure, by the way, like I said, I don't know the Burts Org case by detail. If you're interested, there's masses on the web, so you can check it out. It's a very interesting case, and I'm sure there are also lots of negative things and backdrops and stuff that doesn't work. From what I've heard, from what I've seen in my own studies, it's of course it's very hard to do this. The first thing I would like to point out is that the ambition must be real. All the companies or organizations that start to say, okay, we're going to be turned into a self-managing organization because it seems to be profitable. I read the Burts Org case, awesome. That'll fail, right? If it's not really about, I believe in people, and I believe this is the best way because that's the good way to be, so it's your worldview, it won't work. So you have to do it all the way. Second, clashes are real. It's not an intellectual construct that we talk about, but when you go in and do this, these clashes in worldviews, they're very real. You have clashes in the structures, and I'm sure those of you who work with design, you know this very well, right? You come and do your service design or design thinking or whatever design exercises and workshops and initiatives, and then you meet the rest of the organization, and boom, you don't get further. So these clashes on a structural level, they're real when you try to change, but also in terms of our attitudes. What we've found, for example, is that with the company that we're working with, more in the engineering and the software IT sphere, people come to this company because they like the philosophy. They love the freedom that they get. and they tend to grow with it. So that works, but it's also very easy to feel disoriented, that they describe as a lack of clarity, because we're so used to have these representations, right? Where am I? Which box am I in the organization? Like, how does it work? You know, and if you have a self-managing organization that is growing, that allows this open space, like Fallet says, we have to do the concrete activities together to figure out for ourselves, you know, to make sense of how we want to work and so on. And that's hard. And if you're not used to it, that can be quite disorienting. The other thing is that you're like, even though you buy this philosophy, you might not like, you know, I'm used to having this title or all these status things and all these things that come with the Tayloristic organization. And what am I going to tell my friends? And I had this fancy title before, and now I'm just a, you know, team member. What, you know, so all of these things, cultural clashes, they're real and they are difficult to work with. And the third thing I'd like to say here is, again, emphasize, start with attitude. Another problem that we do, always start with the structures. Okay, here's the new method that we're going to do. And that's fine. We need those, but those are secondary. If the attitude isn't there, nothing's going to work. So this is really what we need to start with and make sure everyone is on board. Just to conclude, to come up with, or to this, what I started out to. So designing alternative models, what does that mean? The final sort of tips. Draw on insights from designing. So this comes back to where we are today. We're talking about a design perspective. For me, design can mean anything, right? Tailor is also about a design of an organization. That's one sort of design, which is distanced. I have worked, like I said, within the School of Design and Crafts because I was interested in the more artistic approach to designing, where we start from experience and it's about making. For me, that's very relevant to this sort of Follettian approach. The pedagogy that comes from there is completely aligned. So we have a good starting point if we start with a design perspective. The other point I wanted to make is why alternative? Why did I put alternative in the title? Well, I think what Fallet asks us to do is to put on an alternative set of glasses, in a sense. It's a question of where you put your attention. Again, this is for coming out of this culture of rationality or a hyper organization where you just focus on the structures all the time, and put your Follettian glasses to say, okay, let's look at the activities instead. Let's look at what we are actually doing, what we are experiencing. So what she offers is, you know, a different starting point, really. And that's the alternative. You could also say, of course, that, you know, from a historical perspective, you know, the Tayloristic model that we're following now, that's really the alternative, because in all other times and ages, we've been working more in a Follettian way. But in our culture, this is actually quite alternative. So an alternative pair of glasses is an alternative starting point. And the third point, which I think is important, is, so what is it about? What do we do? Like, what's the key focus here? We've been talking about the attitude. And that's also a term I've taken from Fallet. It talks about attitude a lot. But what that means in practice, I would say, is we need to focus very much on leadership and training if we want to move to this type of model. And that of course means rethinking what we mean by leadership, because it's not the Tayloristic, manager leading the worker, but it's a view where leadership is related to the activity. So on the one hand, there's certainly a place for the visionary leader to engage people in the purpose, and that may be the CEO, but it may also be the team member, right? And you have a leadership role in this particular project or this phase of the project, but not necessarily in others. So leadership for Fallet is organizing the experience for people, not telling them what to do, right? Because that's what we're supposed to figure out together. And then also training or education. And that I think is as much about unlearning as it is about learning. So it's about unlearning the habits that we have that are so ingrained into us and how we used to do things. And learning is very much about learning the attitude of being responsible, of being experimental, and about how we relate to each other.
We do have a lot of questions now, Anna, but I think we'll take some of it a little bit later. But this one of these questions are just about this attitude perspective, and the question is, how do you find or evaluate that the team members have the right attitude?
That's a good question. And this, I think, points to the problem that somebody asked before. So what's the problem? It's like you can't, right? Because there is no right attitude. The attitude is something that you, I would say the attitude is one of those things that you can't necessarily measure or evaluate. It is evaluated in terms of the results that get done. Do you see what I mean? It's not, or in terms of the evaluation, it's not in terms of worksheet or you response to questions or whatever. The evaluation is in terms of if it's working. And this comes back to Follett's point about, by all means, use my principles, but make them your own, because there can't be any sort of standard principles. It's going to be what works for you in your team. So this is this is really, I think, the core of it, why it's also hard. People have to be active and they have to be responsible. We can't just lean back and say, okay, you decide and I'll follow. But I think we can also move on to the questions.
Yes, thank you very much. A great presentation. But before we go to these questions that is in the chat, I have a following question to the ones that you just answered.
Yep.
And my question is, I understand that it's the team, or you have to find this attitude in your team and together, and you have to make those Follets or whoever what you're using. Do you have to make them your own and see that this is what we work for? But in an quite big organization, that might be that different teams have totally different angles of how to have the right attitude, and that might collide a bit, I think. So there must be some sort of vision or mission for the organization to have this attitude about, or?
Yeah, of course. And I think this comes back to, you can't have only, like, it's not an opposition really to talk about centralization and decentralization. There needs to be some form of alignment, of course. There needs to be some form of brand philosophy in place. And I think also, ideally you should put together a training program, but a training program that is not based on, you should do X, Y, Z, but a training program which is based on this kind of experiential learning, where groups work together to figure, to talk about, okay, we have these principles that we have agreed on. what does that mean for us in our work context specifically? So it's more the interpretation of these principles that you need to do also on a local level. So that doesn't replace the fact that you need like a vision of something, or you need a shared purpose, right? What goes on in the local level is the interpretation in the group in terms of, okay, so what does this mean for us practically?
Oh, perfect. I understand. Maybe go to the questions in the chat, and I think that I'll put down the spotlight from you, and I'll think that I will invite the questioners to raise the question themselves, so they can have some time to maybe deepen it a little bit. So please, David, you might have your first question about the digitalization. If you will, maybe you can ask it yourself.
For sure. No, I'm just curious, because I feel like a lot of talk about digitalization, and digitalization is about, I mean, making things more efficient and I mean, calculating more and measuring more and everything else. But I'm curious if you know of any counterexamples where it's also being used to more kind of enhance the Falletian approach you're talking about.
Good question. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert, but well, two things. I mean, first of all, the Burts Org, the example that I mentioned, they have made a big thing about the Burts Org web, that they designed that from scratch because they didn't think the other IT systems worked. They were counterproductive. So they have designed a system to work for them, to allow their philosophy to dominate rather than whatever system. So that maybe, and it's a lot of written about that as well. So that's one example. The other point I wanted to make is that digital platforms are completely central to self-organized networks that may be global or local or whatever, but where people come together in anything from, you know, maker movements to a lot of amazing things that we're seeing today, where people get together quickly to organize help for people in the Ukraine, or to have Ukraine, you know, even in a war situation where you have in the Ukraine, they have organized a cyber army with people, with hackers that keep attacking sort of Russian targets or whatever. And they have, I don't know how many hackers voluntarily coming together to do this. So that's an organization that's been put up, you know, just in the space of a couple of days, because they have a common purpose and they have the ambition and they just do it. And all of that, of course, is enabled by digital platforms. None of that would be possible. So digital platforms can also be, you know, a condition for self-organizing.
Perfect. Thank you. And next up, we have Emil Johansson with the sun behind you. You have a question about the human you. Will you ask it yourself and maybe make it a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a question. It's more, I think that this time that we have now, it's very important, and I think we tend to skip it. We don't talk about the human view so much as we should, and that's probably why we're making up all this teal and agile and stuff like that. I'm not sure if it's a question, actually. It's more a reflection. Mm. And I think it was really interesting what you said here, Anna, about the digital platforms. They are the ground for the different tribes, I think. So we have to focus more on the tribes. Yeah,
absolutely. Communities. And it's also important to understand, of course, technology is not good or bad. It's how we use it that counts. And again, that comes back to what we want to do it. What's our mindset? What's our worldview there? What is it that we want to achieve? Yeah.
Perfect.
So, thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Trude, and the question is, do you believe attitude comes before action? Must be changes before actions, or do you believe actions together will change attitudes? And if you want to, Trude, you can maybe have some more perspective on that question, or if you're...
Yeah, I don't have the camera on, but yes, I think that as a psychologist, we have tried to change attitudes for decades, and it's not so easy to change an attitude. And I think maybe, for instance, with collaboration or human-centered design, people get the experience. They do some action first, and then the attitude could be changed towards listening to the people in the center, or actually seeing the value of collaborating in a system and not just following the rules of an organization. So I think we have to be very careful about this attitude, how we address attitude, because it may be unrealistic to talk about changing attitudes before we change action. So that's quite interesting in this perspective. And I was wondering if that could be elaborated a little bit on.
Yes, thank you, Trude. That's a very, very good comment. I completely agree with you. Now that you mention it, I haven't thought about it, that attitude might actually give that idea. It's like, oh, let's just change the attitude. But that's not going to happen, right? It's like relying on abstractions or representations, like just tell people that they're going to be like this and they'll follow. Of course, that doesn't happen, right? Our habits are very deep-seated. They're seated in the body, and it's very hard to change a habit. And the only way you can change it is by actually doing it. So I very much agree with you. That's also Follett's point about concrete action, right? You can't just, and you have to be active. You can't just sit around and listen, because then no change is going to happen. And I think also that's what I wanted to point out with the training and education, that it needs to be continuously, training is not something you take a course and then you're done. It's something that you do continuously over the time, and it's not due with traditional, lectures like this. Perhaps you need them as well, but to really get anywhere and to get some real change, you have to be active, and you have to do things, and you have to experience things. And that's also the logic of arts-based education. First you do things, then you reflect. You do things, then you reflect. So thank you for that comment. I think that's very important. Attitudes is not something you can change externally. It's something within you, and it changes slowly over time, and it changes by actually enacting the ideas.
And a follow-up to that might be Petra's new question here, and that is, should we hire new people to the team based on their attitude, or can we work with anyone and change their attitude?
I think that's a good question. I think typically what happens, from what I've seen, when you try to transform a company, obviously you have to have people on board. There are always going to be some people who don't like this, right? It's not for everyone. You will find people that quit. And it's very important then, when you hire people, that it's people that want to, that believe in these values and want to work in this way. So can you change anyone? No, I don't think so, because you can only change people who want to be changed, and some people don't believe in this, and that's fine, right? So it's I guess, like with any change, right? It's going to be hard to get everybody on board, perhaps. But yeah. it's different from situation to situation, but I think that's the general, take what I've seen and read.
Perfect, thank you. And we have quite a long question from David. You might ask it yourself this time as well, so I don't get it wrong.
Sure, I'm not sure if I get it right either. But I guess the question is connected to, because we had a representative from Burts Org in Sweden last year, I think, in an Experio event. And one thing I thought I understood from her is that it hasn't quite worked to implement the model in Sweden because we've divided up home care into 2 different boxes. And I guess my question is kind of related to that, where how do we go about finding the spaces for this in the beginning? Is it a matter of, I mean, you mentioned efficiency arguments to say, well, it's actually a more efficient way of reaching the goals we originally wanted to reach, but through the old model. Do we go about these digital spaces are alternatives on the side popping up kind of as parallel structures? And I'm wondering what you think about where the most, where a good place to start working within the system is. Is it within existing systems and reforming them? Is it outside them and parallel things? Or is it in spaces which are kind of siloed right now that we can find? I'm not sure really what I'm asking, but I hope you understand.
Yeah, I think so. The question is, that problem that we refer to from Burts Org Sweden, I think that's very common in all forms of self-management. You have an idea, right? For example, you legally have to have a CEO that is responsible, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's the first point, right? So we have so many legal regulations that are in place that might counteract, and they might be special for special industries and so on. And once you start looking into it, it's actually a lot more, especially in certain industries, than you want. So that's a basic general problem that you have to face if you want to do something radically different. So that's the first thing, and that's, I don't know what to do about that, but it's a reality. The second thing is that, like, how do we do this? Like within a large organization or outside, or a special unit or an entity. And that's also a classic problem, of course, in innovation, where do we start? Because you can't do it within the large structure because it doesn't work. Good question. I think it depends. There are many examples of companies that have transformed, or many, there are at least some, into self-managing organizations. So that's clearly possible, but any big organizational transformation is going to take time, and it's going to be hard work. So, it's possible, but it depends on the circumstances, on the people driving it, the employees, if they're ready, and so on and so on. Personally, I think starting from scratch is always simpler, because then you can do whatever you want, right? Because even though you do a separate company and so on, you're going to have the interface, and you're going to get together, and you are familiar with this. Many of you working with design initiatives that, okay, works fine here in our little bubble, but then we get to the large organization, and then boom, it sort of, disappears because it hit the wall. And that's always a challenge. I think the most interesting examples are the ones that start from scratch, because then you can do whatever you want and you have no constraints.
But have you done some research, or do you have any opinion about, because it's quite popular in the recent years to have these innovation units inside the bigger organizations that should do the innovation for the organization, or even some of the public sector organizations the recent years have started smaller teams within the organization that not just do the innovation, but try to find new ways how to do the ordinary work. Do you think that is a good way, or is that a bad way to do it?
I don't know. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. There are, good, I haven't seen any research on it that kind of evaluates different, but I mean, I know there is, but I haven't looked into it. But sometimes it's the only possibility, to put it that way, right? Sometimes it's the only way to do it, to leave people alone. But then you always face the problems of integration. Sometimes also what happens is you realize, okay, that's not going to happen, so we'll make that its own unit, its own company, or its own organization that does something in its own name, or whatever. So, you know, I'm not sure if there's an answer to whether that's sort of good or bad. I mean, maybe it's the only way sometimes.
Thank you. Jonas, I think you have some kind of reflection or question about this.
Yeah, we are close to the finish here, but I think some of the things when you talked also, David and Anna, I think we could see things around this transformation now that is nära vård or close care, that where we can see these collision signs of people coming across borders and trying to connect to each other because they know they have to, you know, they have to move to something that isn't really known. So they start to integrate in new groups and new networks, and I think that is in some ways signs of the more Folletian way to handle or organize themselves. So I think that is interesting, because that is, you have a purpose now, you need to move to something new, and you can't really know what to measure or what to handle, and it's not rational at all in some way. So I think that is an interesting field of context for this, for what you have presented today, Anna.
And it's a good ending comment in a way, because I think it's also important to understand that, you know, it's not one or the other. It's not that we have a purely Tayloristic organization or purely Fallet organizations. You know, while these worldviews are incompatible, I mean, they're just not, you can't really combine them. They are combined, right? They're both, these philosophies are both there in our organizations today. So I think sort of if there's any message, so to say, of this presentation, it's really about understanding, just having that clear for ourselves, like what are the values that are behind this? What's the worldview that is behind the way we do things, the organizational forms that we create, and what are the practical consequences, right? Which one should dominate? Should we have these Tayloristic models with all the performance measurements? They're great in some contexts, but maybe not everywhere. And the same thing with the Folletian thing, right? Maybe we, you know, it's not suitable for all contexts to sit there and have our group process. Sometimes, you know, there's simple things that just need to be done. Boom. So the key is really, how do we combine them in a good way? And when is it relevant to work in a Folletian way? And when is it relevant to sort of succumb to the Tayloristic model?